They thought the old woman standing outside the maternity ward didn't belong there. But none of them knew she had sacrificed an entire lifetime just to make that child's first breath possible. The elevator doors slid open with a soft metallic chime as Evelyn Carter stepped carefully into the brightly lit hallway of St. Mary's Medical Center, clutching a pale blue knitted blanket tightly against her chest. At 72 years old, she moved slowly but neatly, her silver hair pinned back with the same pearl clip she had worn for nearly 20 years, her beige coat still carrying traces of the cold November air outside. The maternity floor smelled faintly of disinfectant, coffee, and fresh flowers sent by excited relatives waiting to meet newborn babies. Nurses hurried quietly through the corridors while distant monitors beeped softly behind closed doors. Evelyn's tired eyes glimmered with nervous excitement as she looked toward the nurses' station. Somewhere beyond those doors, her grandson had just entered the world less than an hour ago. Her grandson. The thought alone made her smile through the exhaustion lining her face. She had spent 6 straight hours in the waiting room downstairs after driving nearly 80 miles through heavy rain from her small apartment in Vermont just to be there tonight. Her son Michael had called her at dawn. "Mom, it's time," he'd said, his voice shaking with emotion. And Evelyn had left immediately, barely stopping to pack an overnight bag. The blanket in her arms had taken her almost 3 months to finish. Every stitch had been handmade while sitting beside the tiny lamp in her apartment at night after her shifts at the public library. She imagined wrapping the baby in it herself. She imagined Michael smiling the same way he did when he was little. But just as Evelyn approached the secured maternity entrance, a tall security guard stepped directly into her path. His name tag read Derek Mills. "Ma'am, I'm gonna need you to stop right there," he said politely but firmly, holding one hand near the access scanner beside the doors. Evelyn blinked softly. "Oh, I'm sorry, dear. My grandson was just born. My son Michael Carter is upstairs." Derek checked the clipboard resting on the counter beside him. His expression shifted slightly as he scanned the page again. Then came the sentence that seemed to drain the warmth from the entire hallway. "I'm sorry, ma'am, your daughter-in-law only authorized immediate family." Evelyn frowned gently, not fully understanding at first. "I am immediate family," she said quietly. "I'm the baby's grandmother." Derek hesitated, clearly uncomfortable now. "Your name isn't on the approved visitor list." The words landed harder than he intended. Nearby nurses slowed their steps. A young couple sitting by the window glanced over awkwardly before quickly looking away again. Evelyn's fingers tightened around the knitted blanket. "There must be some mistake," she whispered. Derek shifted his weight uneasily before lowering his voice. "Mrs. Carter specifically requested that you not be allowed upstairs tonight." For a moment, the hallway seemed to go completely silent. Even the elevator doors behind her closed more softly than before. Evelyn stood perfectly still beneath the cold fluorescent lights, staring at the security guard as if the sentence itself had physically aged her another 10 years. Her lips parted slightly but no words came out. The blanket trembled faintly in her hands. And somewhere upstairs, beyond those locked maternity doors, her family was celebrating the arrival of a child, while she stood outside like a stranger no longer welcome in her own son's life. Evelyn lowered her eyes slowly, as though looking directly at anyone in that hallway might cause the fragile dignity she still carried to finally break apart. The fluorescent lights above reflected softly against the polished hospital floors while distant newborn cries echoed faintly from behind secured doors. She was apparently no longer welcome to pass through. Derek Mills shifted awkwardly beside the security station, clearly regretting the conversation but too bound by policy to undo it. "Would you like me to call someone for you, ma'am?" he asked quietly. Evelyn forced a polite smile that looked more painful than tears. "No, thank you," she answered gently. "I do not want to cause any trouble tonight." Her voice remained calm, but her fingers tightened around the folded blue blanket pressed against her chest. The yarn brushed softly against her worn coat sleeve, and for a moment she remembered sitting beside her apartment window 3 weeks earlier, carefully threading every stitch while the first snow of the season drifted outside. She had unraveled one entire corner twice because she wanted it perfect. Babies deserved soft things. Especially this baby. Michael's baby. Her grandson. She stepped away from the maternity doors and moved slowly toward a row of empty chairs near the elevators. The hallway suddenly felt colder than before. A young nurse glanced sympathetically in her direction but said nothing. Another family passed nearby carrying balloons and flowers while excited grandparents laughed quietly together. Evelyn lowered her gaze again. It had been years since she allowed herself to expect too much from anyone. Life had taught her not to. Still, nothing could have prepared her for hearing that she was not considered family. Not after everything. Not after Michael. She sat carefully in the corner chair nearest the window overlooking the parking garage below. Rain streaked softly across the glass while ambulance lights flickered in the distance beyond the hospital entrance. Evelyn rested the knitted blanket in her lap and smoothed one trembling hand across the tiny embroidered initials sewn into the corner. J.C. Joshua Carter. Michael and Lauren had announced the name only last month during dinner at their suburban Connecticut home. Evelyn remembered smiling warmly, while Lauren barely looked up from her wine glass the entire evening. "Joshua sounds strong," Evelyn had said softly. Lauren responded with a brief nod before changing the subject almost immediately. Michael, however, had smiled exactly the way his father used to smile. Proud. Hopeful. Grateful. That smile alone had made the long drive worthwhile that night. Evelyn closed her eyes briefly as memories surfaced one after another with painful clarity. Michael at 6 years old sitting at the kitchen counter doing homework while she ironed uniforms after midnight. Michael at 12 pretending not to notice when she skipped dinner because money was tight that week. Michael graduating college while she cried quietly in the back row wearing the only good dress she owned. Every sacrifice she had made had always felt worth it because her son grew into a kind man. Or at least he had once been. Somewhere over the years, things between them had changed slowly enough that Evelyn almost missed it happening. The phone calls became shorter. Holidays became complicated. Invitations became conditional. Lauren had a way of smiling politely, while building invisible walls around every room she entered. At first Evelyn blamed herself. Maybe she visited too often. Maybe she talked too much about the past. Maybe she embarrassed them without realizing it. Lauren came from money, from private schools and country clubs and summer homes on Cape Cod. Evelyn came from 27 years of balancing overdue bills and double shifts at the public library after her husband died from heart failure when Michael was 9. Their worlds had never fit comfortably together. But Michael always insisted everything was fine. "Lauren is just stressed sometimes," he would say. "Do not overthink things, Mom." So Evelyn stopped mentioning the small moments that hurt. The dinners where Lauren corrected the way she pronounced certain words. The uncomfortable silence whenever Evelyn offered to help. The way Lauren once quietly replaced the homemade pie Evelyn brought for Thanksgiving with a bakery dessert before guests arrived. Tiny things. Polite things. Sharp things. Evelyn stared out the rain-covered window as another elevator opened nearby. A wealthy-looking couple stepped out carrying expensive gift bags wrapped in silver ribbon. The woman laughed softly while adjusting the flowers in her arms. Then she noticed Evelyn sitting alone. Her smile faded slightly before she turned away again. The hospital hallway continued moving around her while she remained perfectly still in the center of it all, like someone forgotten between moments of celebration. Several minutes passed before Derek approached carefully holding a small paper cup. "Coffee," he said awkwardly. "It is pretty cold in here tonight." Evelyn looked surprised. "That is very kind of you. I really am sorry about all this," Derek admitted quietly. "I am just following the authorized list." Evelyn accepted the cup with both hands. "I know," she whispered. "You are only doing your job." Derek hesitated before lowering his voice further. "For what it is worth, ma'am, you do not seem like someone who should be sitting out here alone tonight." Evelyn smiled sadly into the steam rising from the coffee. "Sometimes," she said softly, "life decides those things for us." And as the rain continued tapping gently against the hospital windows, the old woman sat silently beneath the pale hallway lights holding a blanket made for a child she had not yet been allowed to meet, while upstairs her family celebrated a beginning that somehow already felt like an ending. Upstairs, behind the warm glow of the maternity suite windows, Lauren Carter adjusted the sleeve of her cream-colored cashmere sweater, while a nurse carefully placed hospital bracelets onto the tiny wrist of her newborn son. The room smelled faintly of baby powder and antiseptic, softened by the expensive floral arrangements lining the windowsill. Michael stood near the bassinet with exhausted eyes and a tired smile, Completely unaware that less than 3 floors below, his mother sat alone in silence holding the blanket she had made for his child. Lauren watched him carefully from the hospital bed as he reached down to touch the baby's tiny hand. There was genuine tenderness in Michael's expression, the kind Evelyn had once seen every time her son looked at someone he loved. But Lauren's eyes hardened almost imperceptibly. Even now, after 20 years together, she sometimes felt there was a part of Michael she could never fully possess because it still belonged to his mother. "Did your mom text back?" Michael asked quietly while glancing toward his phone charger on the side table. Lauren lowered her gaze for only a second before answering. "I told her visiting hours are limited tonight." Michael nodded distractedly, too emotionally overwhelmed to notice the omission hidden inside her carefully chosen words. "She drove all the way from Vermont," he said softly. "I know she has been excited for weeks." Lauren forced a small smile that never fully reached her eyes. "Michael, I just gave birth 6 hours ago. I really do not want a crowd tonight." "It is my mother," he answered gently. "Not a crowd." The room grew briefly quiet except for the soft rhythmic beeping of hospital monitors nearby. Lauren looked toward the bassinet again. The baby shifted slightly beneath the pale blue hospital blanket, while nurses continued quietly preparing discharge paperwork near the doorway. "You always do this," Lauren whispered finally. Michael frowned. "Do what?" "Make me feel guilty for wanting boundaries." Michael looked confused now, exhausted enough that the conversation felt heavier than it should have. "Nobody is making you feel guilty." Lauren laughed once under her breath, though there was no humor in it. "Your mother walks into a room and suddenly everyone acts like she is some kind of saint." Michael stared at her in disbelief. "Lauren." "No," she interrupted quietly. "You know it is true. Every birthday, every holiday, every dinner somehow turns into a story about how hard Evelyn worked or how much she sacrificed." Her voice remained calm, but beneath it sat years of resentment she had never fully spoken aloud. "Do you know what it feels like to spend your whole marriage competing with someone who never even tries to compete with you?" Michael rubbed his forehead tiredly. "This is not a competition." "Maybe not for her," Lauren replied softly. "But for me it always has been." Downstairs, Evelyn sat motionless beside the rain-covered window while the coffee in her hand slowly turned cold. She watched families come and go through the hospital corridors carrying balloons, stuffed animals, and flowers wrapped in glossy paper. Every few minutes the elevator opened, releasing another wave of smiling relatives hurrying upstairs to celebrate new life. None of them noticed the elderly woman sitting quietly in the corner chair with a knitted blanket folded carefully across her lap like something sacred. Derek remained stationed near the secured doors, though he found himself glancing toward Evelyn more often than before. Something about her silence unsettled him. Most people argued when denied entry. Some became angry. Others demanded supervisors or threatened complaints. But Evelyn had done none of those things. She simply sat there carrying heartbreak with the same quiet grace she carried everything else. A young nurse finally approached Derek near the desk and lowered her voice. "Who is that woman?" she asked gently. Derek glanced toward Evelyn before answering. "Apparently the grandmother." The nurse looked surprised. "Then why is she sitting down here alone?" Derek hesitated. "Because someone upstairs decided she should be." The hallway fell silent again after that, and somewhere deep inside the maternity ward, a newborn baby cried softly while the grandmother who had already loved him long before he was born remained separated from him by nothing more than a locked elevator and a family wound nobody upstairs seemed willing to acknowledge. Nearly 40 minutes later, the maternity floor had grown quieter. The excited rush of nurses and relatives had softened into the low nighttime rhythm hospitals carried after midnight. Rain still tapped gently against the tall windows while pale reflections from passing ambulance lights drifted across the polished floors downstairs. Evelyn remained seated near the elevator with the same careful posture, her hands folded neatly over the knitted blanket, as though she were protecting something fragile from the coldness around her. The coffee Derek had brought her sat untouched beside the chair now, long since cooled. Every so often she glanced toward the elevator doors whenever they opened, only for another unfamiliar family to step out laughing softly together before disappearing into the maternity ward. Each time, her hopeful expression faded a little more. Upstairs, Michael stood alone near the hospital room window while Lauren slept lightly beside the bassinet. The city lights shimmered beyond the glass, blurred by the storm outside. He rubbed his tired eyes and finally reached for his phone again. 7 missed calls from coworkers, 2 messages from friends, and 1 voicemail from his mother sent nearly an hour earlier. Michael frowned slightly and pressed play. Evelyn's soft voice filled the quiet room immediately. I made it safely. The roads were slippery near Brattleboro, but I am here now. Do not worry about coming downstairs. I know tonight is overwhelming already. I will wait until Lauren feels comfortable. Tell her I said she did wonderfully. And kiss my grandson for me. The message ended with silence. Michael stared at the phone. Something about the voicemail unsettled him instantly. His mother sounded smaller somehow. Careful. Like someone trying not to take up too much space in a world already pushing her aside. He looked toward the empty chair beside the hospital bed. Wait, he whispered to himself. Downstairs. Michael stepped into the hallway and immediately approached the nurse's station. Has my mother checked in tonight? One of the nurses glanced toward another staff member before answering carefully. An older woman with silver hair? Michael nodded slowly. The nurse hesitated. She has been downstairs for quite a while. Michael's expression changed immediately. Why? Another uncomfortable silence followed. Finally, the younger nurse lowered her voice. Your wife restricted the visitor list. Michael froze completely. The hallway suddenly felt too still, too quiet. Restricted, he repeated slowly. The older nurse nearby sighed softly. Your mother never caused any trouble, she said gently. She just sat downstairs waiting. Michael stared toward the elevator as realization spread across his face piece by piece. Then came the sentence that seemed to stop the air in his lungs entirely. She has been sitting there alone for almost 6 hours. The hallway fell silent after that. Even the nurses stopped moving for a moment as Michael stepped toward the elevator with growing disbelief written across his exhausted face. And downstairs, completely unaware that everything was about to change, Evelyn Carter remained quietly seated beneath the dim hospital lights, still holding the tiny blue blanket she had made with her own hands for a grandson she had not yet been allowed to meet. The elevator descended slowly through the quiet hospital floors while Michael Carter stood inside with his jaw clenched and his thoughts racing faster than the blinking floor numbers above the doors. The exhaustion from the last 24 hours had vanished completely now, replaced by something far heavier. Guilt, confusion, and a growing realization that while he had been upstairs celebrating becoming a father, his own mother had been sitting alone downstairs believing she was unwanted. The polished steel elevator walls reflected the tension across his face as memories he had not revisited in years suddenly returned one after another with painful clarity. His mother walking 2 miles through snow because her old car would not start when he was in middle school. His mother pretending she already ate dinner so he could have the last serving of soup. His mother staying awake beside him during asthma attacks all night before still going to work at 7 the next morning. Michael had spent most of his adult life trying to build a successful future, but somewhere along the way he had unknowingly allowed the woman who built his entire life to slowly become invisible. The elevator doors opened into the quiet lobby with a soft chime. Derek immediately straightened when he saw Michael approaching quickly across the polished floor. Before he could even speak, Michael's eyes found Evelyn sitting near the rain-covered window exactly where the nurses said she would be. She had fallen asleep sitting upright in the chair, the small knitted blanket still folded carefully in her lap. Her silver hair caught the dim hallway light softly, while one tired hand rested protectively over the embroidered initials sewn into the corner of the blanket. Michael stopped walking. For a moment he could not move at all. The sight in front of him hit harder than any argument ever could. His 72-year-old mother had driven through a storm, waited alone for hours, and never once complained. Not because she did not hurt, but because she loved him enough to make her own pain quiet. The entire lobby seemed to fade into silence around him. Even Derek lowered his eyes uncomfortably beside the security desk. Michael finally stepped forward slowly. "Mom," he whispered. Evelyn stirred gently at the sound of his voice. Her eyes opened slowly, confused at first, until she saw him standing there. Then came the same warm smile she had given him his entire life. Even now, even after tonight. "Hi, sweetheart," she said softly as though nothing at all was wrong. Michael crouched beside her chair immediately. "You have been down here this whole time?" Evelyn tried to brush it aside with a small shake of her head. "It is all right. Lauren just needed rest." "I understand." Michael looked at the untouched coffee beside her chair, now completely cold. Then he looked at the blanket she had protected in her lap for 6 straight hours. The shame in his chest deepened instantly. "No," he said quietly, his voice tightening. "This is not all right." Evelyn glanced around the lobby quickly, uncomfortable with the attention beginning to gather around them. A nurse nearby paused beside the hallway entrance while another family standing near the vending machines watched silently. "Please do not make this harder than it already is," Evelyn whispered gently. But Michael's expression had changed completely now. Years of overlooked moments suddenly connected in his mind all at once. The shortened visits, the uncomfortable dinners, the polite distance Lauren always maintained. And through all of it, his mother had protected him from the truth because she never wanted him to choose between the two women in his life. Michael slowly took the knitted blanket into his hands and stared at the careful stitching. "You made this yourself?" Evelyn nodded softly. "I wanted his first blanket to come from family." The sentence shattered whatever restraint Michael still had left. He looked up toward Derek, whose face immediately tightened with discomfort. "My mother is family," Michael said firmly, his voice carrying through the silent lobby now. "She raised me alone after my father died. She worked 3 jobs so I could stand where I stand today. And somehow tonight she was treated like a stranger in this hospital." Nobody spoke. Even the distant sounds of rolling carts and overhead announcements seemed to disappear for a moment beneath the weight of his words. Derek swallowed hard before answering quietly. "Sir, I was only following the authorized list." Michael nodded once, calmer now but no less devastated. "I know," he said softly. Then he turned back toward Evelyn, whose eyes had begun glistening beneath the pale hallway lights. Very carefully, Michael reached down and took his mother's trembling hand into his own just as he had not done in years. "Come upstairs with me, Mom," he whispered. "Your grandson has been waiting long enough to meet you." The elevator ride upstairs felt strangely quiet after everything that had happened downstairs. Michael stood beside his mother with one hand resting gently against the folded blanket while Evelyn kept her eyes lowered toward the polished floor numbers lighting up one by one above the doors. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. The soft hum of the elevator machinery filled the silence between them while rain continued sliding down the hospital windows outside. Evelyn finally glanced toward her son carefully. "Michael," she said softly, "please do not fight with Lauren tonight." Michael exhaled slowly but did not look at her immediately. "Mom, she left you downstairs for 6 hours. She just had a baby," Evelyn answered gently. "People say and do things differently when they are overwhelmed." Michael shook his head faintly. "You always do that." "Do what?" "Protect everyone except yourself." The words lingered heavily in the small elevator. Evelyn looked down again without answering because deep inside she knew he was right. She had spent most of her life making excuses for the people she loved. First her husband when his health failed. Then employers who underpaid her because she needed the work. Then Michael himself whenever he became too busy to notice her loneliness. Loving people quietly sometimes meant disappearing inside their comfort without them even realizing it. The elevator doors finally opened onto the maternity floor again. The nurses at the station looked up immediately as Michael stepped out beside his mother. A hush seemed to spread instinctively through the hallway. Not dramatic, just human. The kind of silence people fall into when they realize they are witnessing something deeply personal. Derek's earlier explanation had already circulated quietly among several staff members. They knew now that the elderly woman sitting downstairs for hours was not some unwanted visitor causing trouble. She was the grandmother. Michael slowed his pace as they approached the hospital room. Through the partially open doorway, Lauren sat upright in bed now holding baby Joshua carefully against her chest beneath the dim golden light near the window. The room looked peaceful from the outside. Almost perfect. But perfection often hid the deepest fractures. Lauren glanced toward the doorway when she heard footsteps approaching. The moment her eyes landed on Evelyn standing beside Michael, the color drained subtly from her face. The room fell completely silent. Even the soft monitor beside the bed suddenly seemed too loud. Michael stepped inside first. "Mom is here," he said quietly. Lauren's fingers tightened slightly around the baby blanket. "Michael?" "No," he interrupted gently but firmly. "We are not doing this tonight." Evelyn immediately stepped back a little. "I can wait outside if this is a bad time," she offered softly. That sentence somehow made everything worse. Because even now, after being humiliated for hours, her first instinct was still to make everyone else comfortable. Michael turned toward her almost instantly. "You are not waiting outside anymore." His voice was calm, but there was pain inside it now. The kind of pain that comes from realizing someone you love has suffered quietly for much longer than you ever noticed. Lauren looked away briefly toward the sleeping baby in her arms. "I just wanted one peaceful night," she whispered. "That is all." Michael stared at her in disbelief. "By leaving my mother downstairs alone? You do not understand," Lauren said quietly, exhaustion and emotion finally breaking through the composed wall she usually carried so carefully. "Ever since we got married, I have always felt like there was already someone else in your life who mattered more than me." Michael's expression softened slightly, though not with agreement. With sadness. "Lauren, she is my mother." "Exactly," Lauren answered, tears gathering in her eyes now. "Every story becomes about her sacrifices. Every family moment somehow circles back to Evelyn. Sometimes I feel like no matter what I do, I will always come second." The room grew still again. Evelyn stood near the doorway holding the tiny blue blanket against her chest, while listening to words she had quietly sensed for years but never truly heard spoken aloud. And strangely, instead of anger, what she felt most was sorrow. Because beneath Lauren's coldness had always been fear. Fear of not being enough. Fear of sharing love instead of owning it completely. Evelyn slowly stepped forward. "Lauren," she said softly. Lauren looked up cautiously. "I never wanted to compete with you." Her voice remained calm and warm despite everything. "You gave Michael happiness again. That is all I ever prayed for after his father died." Lauren blinked quickly as tears slipped down her cheeks now. "Then why does he always look at you like you are the center of everything?" Evelyn smiled sadly. "Because I was there before he even knew what the world was." The sentence settled quietly over the room. Not harsh. Not possessive. Just true. Michael lowered his eyes briefly while emotion tightened in his throat. He suddenly remembered being 8 years old with a fever while his mother sat awake beside him all night changing cold towels across his forehead. He remembered college applications spread across the kitchen table, while Evelyn secretly sold her wedding ring to help cover tuition deposits. He remembered every invisible sacrifice that built the man he became. Lauren looked down at baby Joshua sleeping peacefully in her arms. And for the first time that night, something inside her perspective shifted. Because one day this tiny child would grow up too. One day another woman might become the center of his life. And suddenly the love Evelyn carried no longer looked controlling. It looked unconditional. The room remained silent for several seconds before Lauren finally looked toward Evelyn again. Her voice smaller now. "I did not think you would actually stay downstairs all night." Evelyn gave a faint smile. "I did not want Michael to feel torn on the happiest day of his life." That answer broke whatever remaining resistance still sat inside Lauren's heart. She looked away quickly, ashamed now not because she had been exposed publicly, but because the woman she had hurt most was still treating her with kindness. Michael stepped closer to the hospital bed and gently touched his son's tiny hand. Then he looked back toward his mother standing quietly near the doorway still holding the handmade blanket no one upstairs had even noticed yet. "Mom," he whispered softly, emotion thickening his voice again. "Come meet your grandson." And as Evelyn Carter slowly stepped forward beneath the warm hospital lights with tears finally gathering in her tired eyes, the room seemed to exhale all at once, because sometimes the people who love the deepest are the ones who ask for the least in return. Evelyn stepped carefully toward the hospital bed, as though she were approaching something sacred. The soft yellow light above the bassinet reflected gently across her silver hair, while the tiny knitted blanket trembled faintly in her hands. For a moment, nobody in the room moved. Michael stood silently near the window watching his mother with eyes that looked fuller now than they had all night, while Lauren remained still against the pillows holding baby Joshua quietly against her chest. Even the nurses passing outside the partially open door seemed to lower their voices instinctively as they glanced inside the room. Evelyn stopped beside the bed and looked down at her grandson for the first time. The world around her seemed to disappear completely after that. Joshua's tiny face rested peacefully beneath the hospital blanket. His small fingers curled loosely near his cheek while soft newborn breaths rose and fell against Lauren's arms. Evelyn's lips parted slightly, but no sound came out at first. Her eyes filled almost instantly with tears she had spent hours trying to hold back downstairs. "Oh," she whispered finally, barely audible. "He is beautiful." The room remained perfectly still. There was something about the way she said those words that carried decades of love inside them. Not dramatic love. Not loud love. The kind built quietly over a lifetime of sacrifice no one fully sees until moments like this. Lauren slowly looked down at the baby in her arms, and then back toward Evelyn standing beside her with such tenderness that shame tightened painfully in her chest again. Because after everything that had happened tonight, the older woman's first expression was not resentment. It was wonder. Evelyn carefully unfolded the pale blue blanket in her hands. The yarn caught softly beneath the warm hospital light, revealing tiny hand-stitched stars sewn delicately into the corners. "I made this for him," she said quietly. "I was worried the hospital might be cold." Michael stared at the blanket as realization crossed his face again. Every stitch represented hours of work his mother never mentioned. Hours spent alone in her small apartment thinking about this child long before he was born. Lauren's eyes followed the careful embroidery across the fabric. "You made all of this by hand?" she asked softly. Evelyn nodded with a small smile. "I had to restart the left corner twice. My fingers are not as steady as they used to be." The honesty in her voice somehow made the room even quieter. Lauren suddenly imagined Evelyn sitting alone at night beneath a small lamp carefully knitting for a grandson she feared she might never fully know. The image settled heavily inside her chest. Slowly, almost hesitantly, Lauren extended the baby toward Evelyn. "Would you like to hold him?" The question seemed to surprise Evelyn more than anyone else. Her eyes widened slightly before immediately softening again. "Are you sure?" Lauren swallowed hard and nodded once. "Yes." Evelyn reached forward carefully, almost reverently, as though afraid her hands were no longer worthy of touching something so precious. Michael gently helped guide the baby into her arms, and the second Joshua settled against Evelyn's chest, the entire room changed. A stillness fell over everything, the kind of silence that feels full rather than empty. Evelyn looked down at the newborn boy wrapped now inside the blanket she had made herself. Tears slipped quietly down her cheeks while a smile spread slowly across her face, softer and more genuine than anything seen that night. "Hello there, sweetheart," she whispered. "I have waited a very long time to meet you." Michael turned away briefly toward the window, overwhelmed by guilt and emotion all at once. Because standing there watching his mother cradle his son, he suddenly realized how close he had come to allowing resentment and silence to erase someone irreplaceable from their family. Down the hallway, one of the older nurses paused outside the room after catching sight of the scene through the partially open doorway. She smiled faintly to herself before quietly continuing down the corridor. Even Derek downstairs would later hear from another staff member that the grandmother finally made it upstairs. Somehow the news traveled through the maternity floor like a quiet correction to something unfair. Inside the room, Lauren watched Evelyn rock Joshua gently with practiced instinct. Not because she had done this once before, but because she had done it thousands of nights throughout Michael's childhood. Suddenly Lauren noticed details she had ignored for years. The slight stiffness in Evelyn's fingers from arthritis. The faded hem on her coat sleeve. The exhaustion beneath her eyes after driving hours through a storm simply to be there for her grandson's birth. None of it looked embarrassing anymore. It looked earned. Lauren lowered her gaze slowly. "I am sorry," she whispered at last. Evelyn looked up immediately. "You do not have to apologize tonight." "Yes," Lauren answered quietly, tears gathering again. "I really do." Her voice cracked slightly now beneath the weight of her own regret. "I thought setting boundaries would make me feel secure. But all I did was hurt someone who loved this baby before he even existed." Evelyn stared at her gently for a long moment before speaking. "Becoming a mother is frightening," she said softly. "You spend so much time worrying whether there will still be enough love left for you, once everyone else enters the picture. Lauren's eyes widened slightly because somehow the older woman had understood her fear perfectly without ever needing it explained. Evelyn smiled sadly. But love does not divide the way people think it does. It grows. The room fell silent again after that. Joshua stirred lightly in Evelyn's arms while rain continued tapping softly against the hospital windows outside. And somewhere deep beneath the exhaustion, hurt, and misunderstandings that had built over years, a family quietly began finding its way back to each other, not through pride or confrontation, but through the simple grace of a grandmother who chose kindness even after being left alone in the cold for hours. The storm outside finally began to weaken sometime after 2 in the morning. Rain still traced slow lines across the hospital windows, but the heavy wind had faded into a distant whisper beyond the glass. Inside the maternity room, the atmosphere had softened too. Not perfectly, not instantly, but enough for the silence between people to stop feeling cold. Evelyn sat in the chair beside the hospital bed with baby Joshua sleeping peacefully against her chest, wrapped carefully inside the pale blue blanket she had spent months making with tired hands and patient love. The tiny rise and fall of the baby's breathing seemed to calm something deep inside everyone in the room. Michael leaned against the windowsill nearby, watching quietly while exhaustion finally settled into his face now that the emotional storm had begun to pass. Lauren remained propped against her pillows beneath the dim hospital lights, her eyes fixed on Evelyn and the baby with an expression that looked unfamiliar even to herself. It was not jealousy anymore. It was realization. For years she had viewed Evelyn through the narrow lens of insecurity. She saw a woman her husband constantly admired, a woman whose sacrifices were praised at every holiday dinner, a woman whose quiet presence somehow filled every room without demanding attention. Lauren had spent so much energy fearing she would never measure up that she never stopped to ask why Evelyn never tried to compete in the first place. Because women who survive hardship often stop fighting for recognition long before anyone notices they deserved it. Evelyn looked down at Joshua and smiled softly as the baby curled one tiny hand around her finger. "He has Michael's eyes," she whispered. Michael laughed quietly under his breath. "Mom, he is 6 hours old." "I know," Evelyn replied gently, "but I remember those eyes." The room fell into another warm silence after that. Lauren watched the interaction carefully, and for the first time since giving birth, she allowed herself to truly relax against the pillows instead of holding herself emotionally rigid. Something about seeing Evelyn with the baby dissolved years of assumptions all at once. This was not a woman trying to take her place. This was simply a mother whose entire identity had been built around loving people quietly. Lauren lowered her gaze toward her own hands resting against the white hospital sheets. "I think I spent so much time trying to protect my role in this family," she admitted softly, "that I forgot families are not supposed to be territory." Michael looked toward her slowly, surprised by the honesty in her voice. Lauren swallowed hard before continuing. "When I first met Evelyn, everyone talked about how incredible she was, how she raised you alone, how she sacrificed everything for you. And instead of admiring her, I think part of me became afraid." Evelyn looked up gently. "Afraid of what?" Lauren's eyes glistened beneath the soft hospital light. "That no matter what I did, I would never matter to Michael the way you do." The confession lingered heavily in the room because it carried years of hidden insecurity finally spoken aloud. Michael stepped closer to the bed. "Lauren," he said quietly, "loving my mother never meant there was less room to love you." Lauren nodded slowly. "I understand that now." Evelyn carefully shifted Joshua in her arms before speaking softly. "When Michael was born, I was terrified too." Lauren looked surprised. "You were?" Evelyn smiled faintly. "I was 27 years old with overdue bills, an old station wagon that barely started, and a husband already getting sick. Every day I worried I would fail him somehow." Her eyes softened as she looked toward the baby sleeping peacefully against her chest. Motherhood has a way of making fear sound like protection. Lauren felt tears slipping quietly down her cheeks now, not because she was being judged but because she was finally being understood. Evelyn reached one hand toward her gently. "You do not have to earn your place in this family by pushing people away," she whispered. "You already belong." Lauren covered her mouth briefly as emotion overwhelmed her completely for the first time that night. Michael sat carefully beside her on the hospital bed and wrapped one arm around her shoulders, while the baby slept safely between generations that had spent too long misunderstanding each other. Outside the partially open doorway, one of the night nurses paused again after seeing the scene inside. Earlier that evening she had watched the elderly grandmother sitting alone downstairs beneath the harsh lobby lights. Now she watched the same woman rocking her grandson beside the hospital bed, while the family slowly healed around her. The difference felt almost sacred. A few minutes later there was a soft knock at the doorway. Derek stood there awkwardly in his security uniform holding a small paper gift bag in one hand. "I did not mean to interrupt," he said carefully. Evelyn looked up immediately with warmth instead of resentment. "You are not interrupting at all." Derek stepped inside slowly, clearly uncomfortable. "One of the nurses told me things worked out upstairs," he said. Then he looked toward Evelyn with genuine regret in his eyes. "I wanted to apologize again for earlier." Evelyn smiled gently. "You were doing your job." Derek shook his head faintly. "Maybe. But I should have looked at you like a person before I looked at a clipboard." The room grew quiet again after that. Because sometimes the deepest apologies are not dramatic. They are simple moments where someone finally chooses humanity over procedure. Derek placed the small gift bag on the nearby table. "The gift shop downstairs was closing," he explained awkwardly. "I thought maybe every new grandfather and grandmother deserves at least one stuffed bear." Michael smiled for the first time all night while Lauren quietly wiped tears from her eyes. And as baby Joshua slept peacefully beneath the warm hospital lights surrounded now by every person who loved him, the cold loneliness that once sat downstairs in the lobby finally began to disappear. By the time the first pale traces of morning light began appearing beyond the hospital windows, St. Mary's Medical Center had fallen into the soft quiet that only exists just before sunrise. The storm had finally passed completely. Rainwater still clung to the glass outside, catching the faint orange glow of streetlights below, while the maternity floor settled into a peaceful stillness broken only by distant footsteps and the occasional soft cry of a newborn somewhere down the corridor. Inside room 314, baby Joshua slept soundly in the bassinet beside the bed wrapped securely inside the pale blue blanket his grandmother had made by hand. The tiny embroidered stars along the corners glowed softly beneath the warm light above him. Evelyn sat nearby in the chair beside the window, her hands folded calmly in her lap now that the long night had finally come to an end. She looked exhausted, but there was peace in her face again. Real peace. The kind that comes after carrying hurt quietly and still choosing love anyway. Michael stood beside the bassinet watching his son sleep while Lauren rested against the pillows with tired eyes and softened expression. Something inside the room felt different now. Not perfect. Families rarely are. But honest. The walls people had spent years building around themselves no longer seemed quite as solid as before. Lauren glanced toward Evelyn carefully before speaking. "Would you stay a few extra days after we leave the hospital?" The question hung gently in the air. Evelyn looked surprised. "Only if you are sure." Lauren smiled faintly through lingering emotion. "I think Joshua deserves to know the woman who made his first blanket." Evelyn lowered her eyes briefly as emotion touched her face again. "I would like that very much." Michael quietly looked away toward the window for a moment, overwhelmed by gratitude and regret all at once. Because the truth was impossible to ignore now. The woman who had been treated like an outsider only hours earlier had never once stopped acting like family. Not downstairs in the cold lobby. Not when she was humiliated. Not even after being excluded from one of the most important nights of her life. Some people carry dignity so deeply that cruelty cannot take it from them. A soft knock came at the door again as one of the nurses stepped inside holding discharge paperwork and a fresh cup of coffee. She smiled warmly toward Evelyn before placing the coffee beside her chair. "For the grandmother," she said kindly. Evelyn blinked in surprise. "Thank you." The nurse smiled again. "The night staff heard you finally got to meet him." Evelyn looked toward Joshua sleeping peacefully nearby and nodded softly. "Yes," she whispered. "I did." The nurse paused near the doorway before speaking one final time. "He is lucky to have you." Then she quietly left the room. Silence settled warmly around the family again afterward. Michael eventually walked over beside his mother and rested one hand gently against the back of her chair. I am sorry, Mom, he said quietly, for all the times I did not notice things were hurting you. Evelyn looked up at him with the same forgiving eyes that had watched over him his entire life. You noticed tonight, she answered softly. That is what matters. Michael nodded slowly while emotion tightened his throat again. Because some wounds are not healed by grand speeches. They heal the moment someone finally sees them clearly. Lauren carefully climbed out of the hospital bed a few minutes later and walked slowly toward the bassinet beside Evelyn. Together the two women stood over baby Joshua in the quiet morning light. No competition. No goals. Just two generations connected by the same small child sleeping peacefully between them. Lauren finally spoke without looking away from the baby. I spent so much time trying to protect my place in this family, she admitted softly, that I almost pushed away one of the people who loved us the most. Evelyn gently touched her arm. Fear makes people forget they are already loved. Lauren looked at her then, eyes filled with sincerity instead of insecurity for the very first time. Thank you for staying anyway. Evelyn smiled softly. That is what mothers do. Outside the hospital windows, dawn slowly spread across the city while sunlight began warming the edges of the clouds left behind by the storm. And inside that quiet maternity room, a grandmother who had once sat alone downstairs feeling forgotten now stood surrounded by the family she had spent her entire life protecting. Because in the end, the people who love quietly are often the ones holding everything together long before anyone realizes they were carrying the weight alone. And that morning, as baby Joshua slept safely wrapped inside his grandmother's handmade blanket, everyone in that room finally remembered what dignity truly looks like.